Welcome to This Explainer. We've got a really fascinating one for you today. We're going to be objectively breaking down some recent political commentary to unravel what is honestly a pretty complex web of events. We're looking at the deep connection between shifting media narratives, some truly rock-solid polling data, and recent high-profile actions taken by the Department of Justice. So if you want to understand the mechanics of modern political influence, you are absolutely in the right place. Here is our roadmap for today. We're going to hit 4 main points. 1. Shifting media allegiances. 2. The MAGA polling data. 3. The James Comey indictment. And 4. The King contradiction. Let's get right into it.
Shifting media allegiances, the pivot.
The source commentary kicks things off by zooming in on the changing stances of some very prominent media figures, specifically Megyn Kelly. And the source points out a pretty stark contrast here. Looking back at her past critiques of Donald Trump during a period of foreign policy tension, she wasn't holding back, calling him a cornered animal on a downward spiral and criticizing him for listening to the wrong advisors. But then, the commentary points out a massive pivot. Just recently, Kelly offered an incredibly impassioned defense of Trump, fiercely criticizing late-night host Jimmy Kimmel over a joke about Melania Trump having the glow of an expectant widow. Kelly framed that as a dangerous assassination joke, firmly returning to her position as Chief Defender.
So, what's driving this? Well, the crucial point is how the original speaker characterizes these abrupt narrative shifts. The source argues that these pivots aren't born out of sudden ideological epiphanies. Not at all. Instead, the speaker describes this as reactionary behavior. The argument here is that certain media figures will adjust their outward principles the absolute second they realize their current takes are no longer popular with their target audience, shifting right along with the winds of change.
Section 2. The MAGA polling data by the numbers.
Now, if audience capture is the motivation, we've got to look at what that audience is actually thinking, right? Let's look at the hard data the speaker suggests is driving these media allegiances. According to the data cited in the source, Donald Trump maintains an unprecedented, astronomical 100% approval rating among the MAGA GOP base. The speaker actually emphasizes this by comparing it to the undefeated 1972 Miami Dolphins. There is 0% disapproval within that specific base. It's just absolute, total alignment.
But you might be wondering, okay, sure, he has 100% of that base, but isn't that base shrinking over time? Well, the source addresses that head-on. The data shows the MAGA base is not shrinking at all. It's actually grown slightly. In November 2024, 28% of Americans identified as MAGA. Today, that number has ticked up to 30%. So that 100% approval isn't just some artifact of a dwindling echo chamber, it's a sign of an iron grip on a very stable and slightly growing segment of the electorate.
And here's where it gets really interesting. To prove the point of what happens when you fall out of step with this base, the source highlights a dramatic shift regarding Tucker Carlson. Back in March 2024, Carlson enjoyed a massive plus 54-point net favorable rating among Republicans. But right now, he has plummeted to just plus 7 points. Guys, that is a staggering 47-point drop in favorability. The commentary presents this as direct evidence that the base remains absolutely loyal to Trump first and foremost. Media figures who appear to dissent or drift, they face severe popularity consequences. Further solidifying this picture of base unity, the source notes the GOP's stance on recent geopolitical events. Despite some really vocal criticisms from what the speaker calls the podcast class regarding foreign intervention, a massive 90% of the GOP actually approves of U.S. military action in Iran. Only 5% disapprove. The polling data is incredibly clear. The base is unified behind the political leadership's direction, completely overshadowing dissenting media voices. And that explains exactly why those same media figures might suddenly change their tune to get back into the base's good graces. Section 3. The James Comey indictment, legal accountability.
Okay, the source pivots here from media narratives to macro-level institutional actions, specifically looking at the recent Department of Justice actions regarding James Comey. The source breaks down a newly announced indictment out of the Eastern District of North Carolina featuring 2 specific counts. Count 1 is for knowingly making a threat to take the life of or inflict bodily harm upon the president. Count 2 is for transmitting that threat in interstate commerce. Both of these counts originated on May 15th, and each carries a really severe maximum sentence of 10 years in prison. To give some context, the source includes remarks from the acting attorney general, who made the DOJ's stance crystal clear. Quote, "Threatening the life of the President of the United States will never be tolerated by the Department of Justice." The acting AG really emphasized that such threats are prosecuted uniformly across the board, actively pushing back on any idea of bias by referencing similar recent cases involving threats against former President Biden and Tom Homan. The message is simple: zero tolerance.
Now, proving intent in threat cases can sometimes be a bit legally tricky, right? But the speaker in our source material points to a highly specific and honestly somewhat cryptic alleged action. They highlight Comey purportedly making numbers in the sand with pebbles. The source argues this action demonstrates obvious intent, especially when you factor in his background and line of work over the years. The speaker firmly frames this prosecution as vital and necessary accountability, because in an incredibly volatile political climate where actual violence has been attempted, the source argues that failing to prosecute these actions would just result in a dangerous free-for-all.
Which brings us to Section 4, the King Contradiction, Political Theater.
Finally, the explainer tackles what the source views as a glaring example of political hypocrisy. They use a really interesting juxtaposition to highlight modern political optics. First, you have Democrats actively participating in No Kings protests, heavily criticizing Donald Trump and accusing him of acting like a monarch. But then, the exact same political body is shown giving rapturous applause, smiles, and a standing ovation to an actual monarch, King Charles III, during his visit to Congress.
The source highlights Donald Trump's own reaction to these protests, quoting him saying, "If I was a king, I wouldn't be dealing with you every day." Drawing on this quote and the stark contrast of that standing ovation for King Charles, the speaker concludes that the political opposition is badly compromised. The core argument here is that these contradictions demonstrate an opposition that stands way more for performative political theater, bringing down fake kings while literally cheering for real kings, than for any deeply held constitutional principles.
As we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you to consider the deeply connected theme running through all of this source material. From Megyn Kelly's sudden pivots, to Tucker Carlson's drop in the polls, to that absolute 100% MAGA unity, we really have to ask ourselves, in a hyper-polarized environment, are the narratives we hear on television and online driven by genuine conviction, or are media personalities simply and constantly adapting to the cold, hard polling data just to keep their audience happy? It's a fascinating question about the true mechanics of influence. Thanks so much for joining me as we unpack these sources today, and I'll see you in the next explainer.